somewhere between the age of 24 and 58. And he was somewhere between 5 feet and 5'9". So basically, he was pretty much every single adult male in London. Most of these letters, of course, were sent by people with slightly biased interests. Some of them were sent by total lunatics. This basically totally confused the police as to the identity of the killer. Some of their ideas were totally inspired lunacy, though. My favourite is somebody suggesting that you birdlime your shoulders. Now, birdlimes are kind of where they used to catch birds. They put this really strong glue on the branch of a tree, so a bird would land on the branch of a tree and it couldn't fly away again. So the idea was you birdlime your shoulders, so when the killer comes up behind you, he grabs you, his hand sticks to your clothes, you then run to the police station while he's clearly nuts. So many of these letters they threw away. They didn't have a way of documenting evidence the way that the police do now, and so many of these letters they had no interest in and they just threw them away. However, there were some letters they took a lot of interest in, and the first one I'm going to tell you about had a postmark on the front of the 25th of September. So that's 5 days before the double event. It was posted 5 days before the double event, and it was sent to a newspaper called the Central News Agency. And it's called the Dear Boss letter because it begins, Dear Boss. And in the text of the letter, the author says, I'm down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled. Now, buckled is old Victorian language. It means I won't stop ripping them until I get arrested. He also said, I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle from the last job to write this with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. I shall have to use red ink instead, brackets, ha ha. He also said, perhaps next time I'll cut the lady's ears off just for jolly, brackets, ha ha. And he signed this letter, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now, as you might recall, 5 days later, when Catherine Eddowes, victim number 4, was murdered, part of her ear was cut off just here. And so the police genuinely believed this to be a letter from the killer. In fact, they believed this for many, many years after these killings had stopped. Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm afraid I'm here to tell you that this letter was not written by the killer at all. It was written by a journalist. Why? Well, of course. Actually, if we start to look at these patterns emerging over these killings, some very clear things emerge. When you look at the dates of the murders and then correspond them to newspaper sales, some very, very clear things emerge. When the first murder happened with Martha Tabram, which was not part of this cycle at all, they sold a lot of newspapers. When the first one in our cycle occurred, Polly Nichols, they sold loads of newspapers. They went through the roof. But then, when our second victim was killed, Annie Chapman, those sales went stratospheric. I think I related to you earlier on how desperate the need was for people to read these newspapers. That wasn't just here. We were living in the age of another superhighway. Of course, not the internet, the telegraph. If you imagine at the beginning of the 19th century, in 1800, it would take about 100 miles a day for a story to travel anywhere. So a murder that happened in Manchester, for example, you wouldn't hear about in London for 2 days. By 1888, this system of technology was so advanced that a story that you heard in London, you could actually relate to someone in New York City only about 6 hours later. So all of a sudden, what you have is a vastly increased readership, which means, of course, that you can sell many, many more copies of your newspaper or many more stories. You can sell the stories onto other newspapers to syndicate these stories, and these stories mean money because nothing sells newspapers like the violent murder of prostitutes, and that's true, as true today as it was then. So these newspapermen were looking at their newspaper sales going through the roof. They got some pound or dollar signs in their eyes, and then what happened? There were no more murders. So the newspaper sales started dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. And so, at some point, around the 22nd of September, the head of the Central News Agency, the newspaper, said to one of his journalists, I need your help with the business of murder. And this man created the character of Jack the Ripper. Quite extraordinary. The fact that he mentioned that the killer might cut the lady's ears off just for jolly was a total coincidence. It was absolute fluke on the journalist's part. So, total luck on his part, and boy did he luck out, because he's created the most famous serial killer in history. Why that name? Well, partly one of the reasons I think this name became so famous is because it spread so quickly. He was the first real urban serial killer of the modern age in which we live. That's one of the reasons. But the other is that the name itself is so brilliant. Jack. In those days, Jack was the most common boy's name. So everybody knew a Jack. Jack was like the guy who lived next door. He was a little bit naughty, but he was okay, really. You know, if you're good at a number of things, you become a jack of all trades, don't you? In our pantomime, we have Idle Jack. Sailors were known as Jolly Jack Tars. When it's cold, Jack Frost arrives. He's even now a hero in all sorts of different dramas all over the place. Jack Bauer, I think, springs to mind. So it's a very common, familiar name. We all know a Jack. And then Ripper. It's such a brilliantly graphic word that it's actually been appended to most serial killers on this side of the Atlantic pretty much ever since. They've never come up with a better name, absolutely. And if you think about it, it could really only come from the mind of a creative writer. So I'm sad to say that the name Jack the Ripper doesn't come from the killer. However, I think I mentioned there was more than one letter, and there was another letter the police took very, very seriously that arrived with them on the 15th of October. This was sent to a man called George Lusk. Now, George Lusk was working with the police, and when opened, this letter, accompanied with a parcel, read, "From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other half I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you'll only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." And in this parcel was half a kidney. This half a kidney was given to a police doctor in the Whitechapel Hospital, about a 10-minute walk from here. And he said, "Oh yes, this is a kidney of a woman who died about 2 weeks ago. She was in her mid-40s. It's a ginny kidney, the kidney of an alcoholic. It also has a disease called Bright's disease, which is a disease that some alcoholics get, but certainly not all." They then took that kidney and compared it with the kidney that remained in the corpse of Catherine Eddowes, and that also had Bright's disease. Unfortunately for us, and unfortunately for history, this kidney was then given to a police doctor who said, "This is a student hoax," and threw it away. So we don't have the kidney, but what we do have is the letter. And that letter makes for fantastically interesting reading. It's what ripperologists mainly think is called a copybook letter. Now, copybooks were a book of formal letter templates that the semi-literate would buy, and that would teach them how to write a formal letter. So you'd literally have, well, what's your address? From hell. Who it's to? Mr. Lusk. Sir or madam? Sir. The body of your text, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, etc. And then here, signed, your name. Now, most literate people would know they don't write signed Joe Bloggs. You just write Joe Bloggs, or yours faithfully, Joe Bloggs. This guy wrote signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. That's one indication this is a copybook letter. The other thing is the handwriting itself and the spelling. Pretty much every single word is misspelled. And there are smudges and smears all over the paper. Clearly, this is the handwriting of somebody who's not used to reading and writing a lot. The writing of a semi-literate person. Hindsight, as I said, is a wonderful thing, and we've accumulated so much more information about behaviours than we had 123 years ago, with a huge catalogue of information in many, many forms, and as those behaviours take. And one of them, of course, is handwriting. And that handwriting has now been studied extensively. And in the 1960s, the FBI were able to say that this is very, very clearly the handwriting of an extremely violent and dangerous sexual sadist. Someone who's capable not only of imagining, but then carrying out anything that occurs to that warped imagination. So ripperologists would agree that this is the only genuine letter they ever got from the killer. It's interesting he didn't want to be known as Jack the Ripper. He wanted to be known as Catch Me When You Can. And Catch Me When You Can was actually the refrain or the chorus of an old music hall song that told the story of a very beautiful young woman trying to escape from the amorous advances of a very old man. And whenever he got close, she would dance away from him singing Catch Me When You Can, which is exactly how the killer imagined himself in relationship to the police. Okay, the next place we stop is our last stop on the walk tonight. It's an area called Spitalfields, where all of these women lived, and in fact a couple of them also died.
What shall I do?